it was about 3 weeks after I had joined the team at Depot that I first noticed it. Now, on this team, we worked together, like a lot, maybe more than teams you're used to working on. It was like a meeting all day, except it wasn't a meeting because meetings are terrible. This was more of a doing. So we would collaborate all in the same room, and that meant doing the work, but also while we were doing the work, talking about the work, obviously. Lots of conversations about the work and maybe, Fred's new haircut, because that was distracting. But what my point is, in all of those words, that's a lot of words in 3 weeks. And in all of that talking, all of those words, not one of those words was agile. And that might also not be weird for you in your context, your teams that you work in, but I've made quite a bit of, at least the last 10 years of my work has been a lot about bringing agility to software teams, whether we called it that or not. But the word tends to follow me around, and that's my point. So I notice when it's not there. We were, even though we weren't talking about it, we were doing plenty of the things that you and I might file under the letter A, things like mob programming, test-driven development. We had a pretty decent pipeline straight to production. And, remarkably, I thought, for most of the teams that I've been on, a remarkably lightweight process. We would just talk in the morning and probably ship what we talked about, often by lunchtime, maybe the next morning. But really quick. There was no sprints, there were no ceremonies, there was just, doing it. So who needed to talk about Agile? We were already living it. We were living the lean, DevOps, extreme programming dream. It was perfect. Almost. So there's always an itch somewhere, right? There's always the next bottleneck in the system. And for us, it was the fact that it still took 30 minutes to get code into production. Now, that also might not sound like a big deal, but it wasn't we pushed a button and then half an hour later there was code running. It was we pushed a button and had to remember 15 minutes later to go check staging, smoke test it. If nothing caught fire, merge to main, and then that moves on to production. So this was really, for as fine-tuned as we had a lot of things, this was really sticking in our craws, this manual sort of go back, and if you forgot it, things would batch up in staging, and then of course that accumulates risk. Anyway, so this approach made sense at first because when we first got to the team, Greg's the other coach, they did not have any automated tests to speak of. Well, none that passed, none that ran in under a minute, so effectively none. But we had worked with the team pretty hard on getting test-driven development in place. That's just how we did it for the next couple of months. And before long, there was this good foundation of fast, deterministic, reliable unit tests underneath quite a lot of the code. And that's not to mention when, about the time that Frankie went to the woodshed for 2 weeks, it solved all of our Cypress problems. So now we had a couple of, well-placed end-to-end tests. So if you're picturing a testing pyramid, anybody testing pyramid, shout out, woo. If you're picturing it's more of a testing thumbtack, but the point is, things were getting stable, and things were getting, right in that star where we would go check staging, things were getting boring. It felt really rubber stampy to go check the thing that we knew was working, right? We had quite a bit of automation. Nothing would get to staging, such was the pipeline and its tests. Anyway, so it was time, Greg and I kind of had a conversation hey, let's talk about this. Maybe we should we just delete staging? Get rid of that branch, get rid of the environment? And Greg got really excited because he liked deleting things. But then, the excitement flickered when his brain kicked in. He's okay, no, we can't take that big of a step yet. What if we need it? So we okay, maybe we won't delete staging, but maybe let's stop using it. Wait, no, we'll stop using it by default. It'll still be there in case we really want to smoke test something if we're not sure of it, but let's just, by default, go to Maine. All right? Sounds like a plan. Great, let's talk to the team about it this morning. Wait a second. What do you think Steve's going to say? Steve, another member of this team, he was the oldest, he was the youngest old programmer. I got to get that right. He was the youngest old programmer I'd ever worked with. Like, he wasn't fresh out of college. He'd been a few places, but not many. And apparently he had just gone to the right places where things were terrible enough that he, at one point, lectured me about how no good self-respecting engineer deploys on a Friday. Like, not even circumstantial, like, well, in this team it wasn't safe to deploy on a Friday, we'd always lose our weekend, so we don't do that here. It was like a general rule, like, my nerd card should be revoked because I suggested that we deploy on a Friday. He had this really stuck in his head. And so when we suggested, of course, that the whole going straight to Maine thing, his reaction was actually kind of predictable. It was like, no, we stage our changes to production. How else would you do it? We can't do that. And we tried, Greg and I tried reasoning with him, showing pros and cons of like going, we told him the story of trunk-based development. But he wasn't hearing it. It went nowhere. And so, Greg and I went back to our corner. And I chewed on this problem for a while. And I thought, okay, maybe the solution is technical. Maybe I just make an automation in there that if the stage pipeline passes, then we just merge to main and go kick off the production one, right? So maybe there's a technical solution to this human problem, he said, for the 19th time being wrong. So, I started chopping away at the code, getting into that. I had to learn Git hooks and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it turns out, so we were using AWS Amplify, which if you've ever done it, it's sort of like a baby framework for your app just to get it started. But we were still on the baby framework as far as the pipeline went, and it just wasn't capable of doing this. It had the pipelines were married to branches, and there wasn't any two ways about it. With Amplify. So we would have to migrate our entire pipeline in order to make that happen. And we weren't ready for that kind of investment yet. And I tinkered with a couple of other ideas, but obviously I was not going to solve this problem with technology. Except I did have one more idea. And I was just playing around with Git hooks. And I thought it was a relatively stupid, relatively harmless, relatively small bit of code that I added to the Git push hook. And so the next time we were with the team, I was like, are they going to notice? The next time we were mobbing together and finishing something up, the driver, it was Frankie who was driving again, she pushed the changes to staging. And then all of a sudden on her window, on her screen, a browser window opens right next to the IDE. And it just happened to be open to the GitHub diff page showing the differences between staging and main, and offering a shiny, jolly, candy-like green button that would allow us to merge straight to main. And Greg didn't miss a beat. I didn't tell him it was coming, but he was like right in there. He addresses the team. So, how confident are we in this change? Should we merge it now? And sort of, kind of bypass the whole waiting for staging pipeline to fit. And Steve reflexively, of course, crosses his arms. No, we've got to wait for, but Frankie and Tom, they were intrigued. They were like, wait a second, why not? And Greg and I just stepped back and let the three of them sort of bat that around, right? And it almost took the shape of the same conversation that Greg and Steve and I had, the other day, and we were like, oh no, this is going nowhere. But they managed to actually they took in the focus of should we always do this thing, or should we, in this set of changes, should we push to main? And he was like, yeah, okay, I can't, he was just out of reasons to say no, right? Because it was a small, we'd learned to work in very small changes. And And so, okay, this doesn't have any back-end stuff. We couldn't do it for one with back-end stuff, but this one, okay, just for now. Okay, so we got one by him. And, for the next couple of days, so remember, this line of code is just in there. It's working, the whole time. So every time we were ready to push something to staging, we were prompted with this choice. And the team made it together. And sometimes it was a no, but more and more often, it became a yes. Yes, let's just bypass the whole, we don't need to wait. Let's just get this rolling right up to Maine. And, the excuses for doing so just kind of wrote themselves. Well, this is small enough. We tested the crap out of that thing. But, there's loads of unit tests on this one. So after about a week, we had our pipeline time had been cut in half. And more importantly, like the toll that it was taking for somebody to have to remember and go back, that was the thing we felt the most. It was just smooth, not having to go back and check that stuff. And at one point, maybe a few weeks beyond that point, Steve actually suggested that we delete the staging environment. So all from one line of relatively stupid, relatively harmless script, I found a way to, make a technical solution to a human problem by letting the choice belong to the team. Anyway, howdy, Sweetwater. I'm John Fazzaro. There's a lot of familiar faces and a lot of unfamiliar faces. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Fazzaro. I've been a professional nerd for about 22 years. I started as a developer. That's a picture of me at my first job, writing code, sitting in a corner office, because there were 4 of us in the whole company, and everybody got a corner office. I've also been a software architect. I did that for about 5 years. I still couldn't tell you what exactly it is. And these days, what I do is I could most concisely sum up as nerd coach, or sometimes lean software agitator. That involves not only, coding with teams, but also doing a fair amount of this hand-waving in front of slides thing. I'm currently consulting with Industrial Logic. You may know us as the Modern Agile people, if you know Modern Agile. And here are my certifications. These are the books that have changed the way I work, and I think that's a lot more interesting than to show a slide of certifications. Anyway, so this talk is a little bit of an ongoing experiment for me. As I said, I've done a fair amount of public speaking professionally, and I will have clever slides and wave my hands and say my ideas at you, but over time I think I've come to think that maybe I'm going about this all wrong. And with your permission, I want to try something a little different. See, early on in my work, I learned that some of the best ideas about how to develop software, particularly great ideas, are often counterintuitive. And the longer that somebody had gone in their career before encountering one of those great ideas, the more counterintuitive it would be. The canon example for this, for me, is somebody who, trying to teach TDD to somebody who's written code for 15 years quite successfully without it. It's really hard to show them that the thing that they've been missing out on is anything worth talking about. And the more, so I found myself in the place of trying to inject really counterintuitive ideas. And I learned to actually relish when people would look at me like this in a meeting. And because I thought that that's okay, I have their attention. They're really paying attention to me. And I thought it was a good sign, but I realized as they didn't actually turn out to follow my direction or advice or anything, that it was less about winning their hearts and minds and more about feeding my attention-seeking behavior. So I still think I had the right ideas. I just wasn't as effective as I wanted to be in getting them across. And I've amassed a pretty decent and varied set of skills at this point in my career, but one of them has kind of seemingly danced just out of reach for a while now, and that's being able to tell a good story. So I've been working on that, and the first thing that I had to learn about stories was what they are not. Okay, so a story is not just a list of facts or events in chronological order. That's an anecdote or an accounting. It's a one-way interaction, right? A story, on the other hand, goes two ways, right? Even when the words are coming from one person, one writer, one teller, it invites the listener into a different space. When you're telling a story, you take a person on a journey somewhere else where they're not, in another context. And wrapped inside that journey, and here's the part that was actually, that I felt like maybe I was missing. Wrapped inside that journey could be an idea that we hold together as talker and teller and listener, and an idea that we can share together with a strong, stable handoff. As opposed to just winging an idea across the table at somebody. So I think that's what I've been missing. So I've been so excited about the ideas that I wanted to inject into other people's heads that, I was impatient and I was careless about how I did it. So I guess my hypothesis is, like I said, this is an experiment for me, but my hypothesis is that if I can tell a story, then maybe they'll stop looking at me like this, and maybe we can actually build some great software together. So it wouldn't be a proper experiment if I didn't measure anything, right? So the best, maybe one way we can measure is if you guys whip out your device and go to that QR code. There's a very brief 2 questions in there. If you could answer by at some point today, that would be really helpful feedback for me on this little experiment. So a side note, while you're snapping that picture, there's a dad joke in the subtitle. You may or may not have noticed. Of course, I'm referencing the agile practice of user stories in a backlog, right? So that brings into question, I'm talking about stories. Is a user story a story? And I think it's not a story, but it is a story. It works in the same way. So a story takes a person on a journey into a context that they're not used to so they can absorb an idea that they might not ordinarily absorb. A user story is very similar to that. A well-written user story takes a developer on a journey into the user's, to the user's world to establish an empathy so that maybe, we can stop guessing so much at what the user wants and think from their perspective and, maybe do a little bit less of the game of telephone part of building great software. And maybe that's working where you use user stories, or if you don't use user stories. Maybe that's working, maybe it's not, but that was the original intent. That's the point. That's why they're called stories. Anyway, speaking of user stories, here's a story about a user story that sparked a conversation that changed everything for Roger's team. See, the only emotion that Roger had ever shown me up to that point was, I've got this, I don't need your help. But here he was sitting on the corner of my desk with his face in his hands going, John, I don't know what else to do. I feel like I've tried everything. They just won't go any faster. Roger was the manager of the mobile development team at a company we'll call Acme. So this is like a iOS and Android team. And he was right. They were not getting through their stuff fast enough to actually deliver value to Acme. Their estimates were always wrong, and they just, for whatever reason, even if they put in extra time, they weren't going any faster. And Roger was actually suffering the most because he had just gotten out of a conversation with his boss. And the directive from the top was that if the mobile team couldn't pick up the pace, couldn't start performing better, that they would at least have to cut the price in half and outsource that entire function in order to make it make sense for the business. And so Roger was a little weird. He kept me at arm's length. He didn't like me too much, but he was a good dude, and he really cared about the people on his team. And this was not only going to be a black mark on his work, but also a lot of people he cared about were going to get hurt if this happened. So he was really upset. I didn't coach Roger's team, so I didn't have a whole lot of context. I was working with the web team across the hall. But I did offer, in that way that sometimes an annoying Agile coach will do, some just generic advice that he probably already had thought of. But I said, okay, so you have like a good lay of the land of all the work that your team is doing, and is there a sense of one thing being a priority where you can kind of stop doing the others and focus on that? And he just kind of scowled at me. He was like, John, this is the real world. We have to get all our work done here. And so, he took off, and I figured that was done. I figured that was the end of my interaction with Roger. But later that afternoon, there was a meeting that kind of last minute showed up on my calendar from Roger and his team. So, I showed up. And Roger comes in late with his laptop, and he's a little sweaty and he's flustered. And he opens up the laptop, plugs it into the projector, and he brings up Jira, and it's got this story in it. As a mobile user, I want to sign up for a car care subscription so that I can enjoy their wide and attractive array of services. It's a fine story. So car care was actually a very lucrative partnership for Acme. And we kind of basically, we got our users to sign up for their service, and that's how the whole thing worked. So Roger says, okay, I need an estimate for this story. And at first we were all like, okay, well, there's no, what do you mean by, so that's just the story level, there's no detail. Well, lo and behold, all the business analysts came in clutch, and there's an 11-page document of technical specs and perfect requirements, and everything's going to work just this way, and all you have to do is type it in, CodeMonkey kind of requirements document. So that, of course, so the team, and at this point, it was really cool. The team just kind of whizzed into action. Roger and I kind of sat back, and iOS developers huddled over here, Android developers huddled over here. Sometimes they'd send a messenger across, and they'd group up, and they'd break up, and it was a very fluid collaboration for a few minutes, and there were sticky notes and calculators and stuff. And finally, the buzz kind of settles down, and they say, okay, we've got an answer. This is going to take about 6 weeks. And the color sort of drains from Roger's face. And he's like, no, the business needs this live within a week. And it's kind of part of me is like, well, why did you ask then? But this isn't going to work. The business needs this live within a week. He liked to say the business as if about everybody outside of IT, as if their paychecks came from somewhere else. But he kind of descended into this sort of string of corporate speak, which essentially amounted to, yeah, I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday to get this done, or we're going to have to put in extra time and really crunch, and the oxygen just drained from the room. And so to pierce that silence, I, of course, asked the stupidest question that I could think of. Why? Why what, John? Roger was already irritated. Why does the business need that live within a week? Because that's the ask, John. That's the ask from the business. He also liked to use ask as a noun. And I was like, okay, no, why is that the ask from the business? And he muttered something about an SLA, and I kept trying to get to the story behind the story, right? And he was obviously upset. He didn't necessarily follow me. But as we were going back and forth, Masha, a young product manager, she actually did know the answer to my question. So she kind of spoke up and shared with us that she had learned through side channels that the partnership with Car Care was actually in a lot of trouble. The sign-up numbers were not what we had promised them. And the play here was actually that most of Acme's users were on Android. And so we were going to get the sign-up form in front of those users to try to tap into a larger part of our user base and get the sign-up numbers up. So as Masha spoke, I leaned over Jira on Roger's keyboard and just sort of started tapping, and I rewrote the story. We think that we can boost Car Care subscription signups if we present the sign-up option to users of our Android app. And Roger flips out. He's like, you can't change the requirements. Those are the requirements. And I'm like, relax, that's not requirements, that's a story. I'm telling a better story. And he just wanted to go back and forth with me about how this legal document in Jira, and you can't change it. But while Roger and I were going back and forth about that, one of the iOS engineers perked up and said, hey, if this is just about Android, if we don't have to do the iOS work, that's like 10 days off the estimate. And he had Roger's attention. And then Dave, who was an Android developer, but also a very creative fellow, and you could tell because he had his septum pierced. Dave says that, hey, what if the sign-up was already on the web app. What if we just put a button, like a call to action inside the Android app and draw attention to it and just ship that? And this is the sort of the part where everybody carries Dave out of the room and cheers. And so of course we had that. They had that change in production like 2 days later. And Roger's kind of walking around like he's nervous that he's going to get in trouble because they changed the spec or they didn't do exactly what was in that Word document. But he was also desperate enough to hold his breath and see if he did get in trouble for it. So he just, and of course he didn't. By the end of the week, there was actually like an audible buzz about the Car Care sign-up numbers. And a few sprints later, Roger stops back by my desk to tell me that the conversations about outsourcing his team had just completely stopped. And I was like, oh yeah, that's amazing. What do you think happened? What changed? And he just, John, there was so much work in our backlog that wasn't going to be valuable at all to Acme. We just started asking why to everything they sent over, and it just all kind of melted away. And that's how you go fast in software development without really trying. So a story, as I've come to think of it, a story has 5 parts. Okay, and this is a mental model, and George Box tells us that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So remember that. This is not the actual story, it's just a map. So the first of the 5 segments in which you build the world and you're inviting the listener into it. And this one's tricky because building a world takes like some detail, but also getting somebody to come into it, inviting them in a way that's interesting means you got to keep it tight, right? So this is a really tough needle to thread on the way into the story, and I'm not sure that I did it so well at these last couple of stories, but you can't like Tolkien a tree for somebody and expect them to come, and with their rapt attention. The second part of the story is when, having built this world and invited somebody into it, you change something. You change something either small or drastic or noticeable, make something unexpected happen. This is the shift. This is the beginning of the suffering, which is the third. That's the third stage, is where because something changed in this world, everything goes all fat and saggy, like the line there, and this is the challenge. Right? Things are terrible for a while. But then in response to that, somebody or something in the story responds to this suffering and starts behaving in a different way, and that kind of turns things around in a way that changes that world that we first came into in the first stage. And the 5th stage, is just, we're describing the way the world is afterward. So if you're like me right now, you're kind of mapping this onto like your favorite story. For example, Luke is a farm boy, and he's got his head in the stars, but he's got a grumpy uncle who won't let him grow up and leave the farm. But then he meets a wizard and a couple of robots, and his aunt and uncle are murdered, so there's nothing for him here now. I'm going to come with you to learn the ways of the Force. So he follows the wizard and the robots into space, and they get captured by the evil Galactic Empire. They fight a lot of terrible battles. Sometimes they win, sometimes they get their asses handed to them. Luke actually loses his hand at one point, and his friends get hurt and kidnapped. So things are terrible. But this whole time, Luke has been learning the ways of the Force. And he's got a different way now to fight and to think. And he uses that way to rescue his friends and to defeat the Empire. They destroy the Empire, and he gets closure with his father, and the galaxy is saved. So like that works at a grand, like an epic scale. Like I just covered 3 movies. But this is also fractal. This is fractal. This works at much smaller segments too. For example, Indy is face to face with the golden idol. He has studied and adventured and fought and done all kinds of crazy things to get to this point, and now it's right in front of him. He could almost feel it, but he's got to get the weight right. So he does the switch with the bag of sand, and he's got the idol in his hands. And this is it. This is the moment. And he thinks he pulled it off. But as he turns to walk away, there's like a sickening kind of grinding sound behind him, and the temple starts to collapse. There's poison darts flying at him. And his friend, who was supposed to be there to help him, his friend betrays him, steals the idol, drops the whip on the other side of a big hole, so Indy realizes he has to do this all on his own. He takes a deep breath, and he leaps across the hole, and he just barely makes it. So he's out of the woods, except for the giant boulder that's chasing him now, and he just barely outruns that. He makes it out of the cave with the idol, and of course he gets it into a museum where it belongs. Just kidding. There's a nasty French guy out there with a horrible laugh, and he speaks Havidos, and Indy doesn't, and so he gets to walk away with the idol. So the point there is not only are stories small, but they don't always end well. This is not about better, right? This is just about different. So you could see it more maybe as an overhead map than a better or worse graph. And stories are big and small, but they're not only in movies and books. And I assume you haven't lost a hand in a galactic battle for freedom, or had your new golden fertility statue bogarted by a rude French guy. But there was that time when you were really hungry and you wandered over to your kitchen and you were like, man, it's pickle time. Okay, so I'm gonna get the jar of pickles, and I'm so excited for this. Your mouth is watering, and you're just ready. And then you try to get the lid off, but it's stuck, right? It won't budge. Okay, you're banging it on the counter. You're like torquing it every which way. It's not happening. The lid's not coming off. This is awful. This is the worst anybody has ever felt, at least in regard to pickles. So then your wife walks in, and she just grabs it and gives you a peck on the cheek and like torques it clean off in one go, and everything's great. You got a snack, and you learn that your wife's arm wrestling lessons are totally paying off. So like stories are everywhere, and this curve is all around you all the time. You just have to look for it. Also, I don't know if anybody is familiar. Is anybody familiar with Virginia Satir's change model? That's what this graphic is actually from. I'm not surprised, because Virginia Satir is not in software, right? She was a psychologist, and I believe she did a lot of research on family dynamics. And really, what this was originally meant to show is like, this is what happens to a family when a new baby arrives, or the mom and dad get divorced, or there's a blended family situation. It was meant to model, like, this is what happens in families when there's a change. And So why do I know about this if I'm a geek, right? And the reason is my work took me in a direction of not only trying to make code better, but also trying to make teams better. And teams are made of people, and people are messy, and you have to read about them. So this kind of got onto my radar that way. And of course, you could make the parallel that like a team is like a family, but I think it's actually more fundamental than that. What's going on in a software development team. Software itself is about change. And software is the business of change as applied to information technology. And stories give us as knowledge workers, as people building software and maintaining it and running it together in a complex ecosystem, stories give us a way to experience change safely together. So most of the time, if you're going through this curve, you are experiencing a lot of suffering right in the middle before things turn around, and that's a strong experience for you to have. But not everybody needs to have that experience in order to learn what you learned by doing that. And stories are a way to take people on that journey in a safe way. For example, when if we join a new team, or we pick up a new confusing user story, or work in a technology stack that we've never touched before. This is happening to us. So here's a story about when all three of those things happened to a team I was on. So the Tiger team had assembled. It was day 3 of the shiniest new greenfield project any of us had ever been on. And we already had the pipeline up and running with notifications and everything. It was really exciting. We were breaking ground on a high-profile, long overdue rewrite of our biggest client's e-commerce system. And we were going to throw the book at it. Like, if you've ever heard of the second system problem, this was it. Everything that had ever gone wrong on every other project, we were going to nip that in the bud. We were going to do it right this time. What could possibly go wrong? And of course, we were excited about the new things we were going to get to do, but we were also just as excited about the things we weren't going to have to do. Particularly, we were not going to have to code a login page. And day 3 was the day we weren't going to do that. So more specifically, we were going to drop in an OAuth authentication UI provider. It was from Azure Active Directory B2C. So yeah, there's that. Anyway, we were building the website using React. And so we just kind of Googled, like, hey, React, Azure AD B2C, and lo, there was an NPM package with exactly that, except with hyphens in the middle. So, of course, this was going to be a piece of cake. And, we had our fresh coffee. It was morning in the mob room. It's another team I mobbed on. It's like a pattern. So the driver fires up the console and installs the package, and we're, like, getting excited, pulling in all the different OAuth, like configuratory bits, this ID, this email address, this hash, this whatever, and like it was so exciting. It was a little like shaving a yak for a while. But did I mention that we weren't going to have to build a login page? So anyway, Ricky fires up the local site, and of course the browser was blank. It was blank. There used to be a nice atomic React logo, like the Create React app, straight out of the box thing. And yeah, we killed that. So we checked the console, and of course there's some red in there. It's like, oh, we got to fix this. Okay, so we tweaked that. No sweat. Just okay, run it again. Still blank. Okay, fascinating. So let's try it this way now. Wait, get Greg on the phone. He's the guy that's, make sure that thing is running. Okay, we'll try it again. We kept at it. And somebody suggested, like midday, mid-afternoon, I was getting a little tired in that room. They were like, hey, let's take a break. And Dave Dave shot daggers. You could take a break. I'm staying right here. We've almost got this. So there we were, sticking to it. It was about 8:45 that evening that we really started to worry about that blank screen in the browser. We had been at this simple task all day solid and into the evening, and there hadn't even been any distractions, no meetings, no I have to go do email, or no breaks. We were laser focused on this thing. And now we were out of ideas, out of gas, out of patience, out of time. We'd only estimated an hour for the authentication work. What were we going to tell the client? How could we call ourselves professionals? We sure as hell were the Tiger team. We were stuck, we were incompetent, we were confused, we were embarrassed. And it was with that emotional vector that we made our way out to the parking lot and called it a day against every instinct. 12 hours of focused work and nothing to show for it. Somewhere in the wee hours, I remember I had a moment between sleep stages when I thought about the NPM package and also the GitHub repo together. The next morning when I got in, I noticed that Ricky and Dave were already in the mob room. They were already pairing, and it was definitely a different vibe. There was excited screen pointing. There was frantic tapping and on keyboards and laughter. And so I approached, and I was like, I noticed there was definitely a working auth UI where there hadn't been, that we definitely didn't build. And I was like, what's going on, guys? John, the auth is working. We had the wrong version of the library from the NPM package versus the docs we were following in the GitHub repo. And I just about dropped my coffee. So, and Dave added, yeah, Ricky thought of it on the way home, like right after she pulled out of the parking lot. So of course, the lesson here is that if you and your teammates mob program closely enough, that your sleep paralysis demons will synchronize. Just kidding. What we learned here, actually, the hard way, was what Kent Beck wrote about in Extreme Programming Explained decades ago. He wrote, software development is a game of insight. And insight comes to the prepared, rested, relaxed mind. So what if I had just spelled out for you that you can't change somebody else's mind, but you can use a line of code to shape their path? Or the work you're given isn't inherently valuable. Going fast isn't about more, it's about doing less. Or getting stuck is the job, take a break before you need a break. Would any of that have landed? Maybe. Now think about the ideas that you have and the conversations that you have with your team or the other people you work with. The ideas that you want to already be in other people's heads. Think about those. What stories could you tell? What are you sitting on? But I'm boring. I don't have any stories. I write code. I just, there's no stories in my life. Nobody thinks that they have stories. But what was up with that email that you glanced at right before you came here? Or the tense moment in the meeting last week? Or that time that you had to make a choice and you just couldn't see the other side of it? You couldn't tell. Did you make the right one? Remember how small this curve can be. It'll fit anywhere. And all day long, your world is changing. Wherever there's change, there's a story about that change. And if you're changing, if you weren't changing, you'd already be dead. So being a storyteller isn't about something it's not something you're born with or not. It's a skill like any other to be developed, to be practiced. And here's how I've been practicing. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, but every day I've got a little reminder that pops up, and there's a couple of questions that I answer. And one of the questions is, where was the story? And I don't actually write out the story. I just write like a one-liner note that usually only means something to me. And most of these would probably make terrible stories. I wouldn't bother to go back and write them out. But the point is, there are so many more than I thought there would be. And it was just because I started actually asking and answering that question, now that I'm in the habit of looking for them. So I want to wrap this up with a challenge to you and ask, what's in your backlog? What have you been sitting on that you're too shy to publish? What experiences are you hoarding? What do you keep into yourself that if you took the time to bundle safely and share, might make all the difference to somebody else? And you don't have to come up here. You start small. Like with everything, start small, right? This could be just in a one-on-one, or with a friend, or in a meeting. A tweet if you're still into that sort of thing. And like I said, you don't have to come all the way up here if you're not ready. But you have stories that we need to hear. So please don't wait too long to start sharing them. Thank you.